Hi, welcome to this fourth clip of this week's lecture on society. Having discussed the kind of influence of French sociology at its inception in the work of Émile Durkheim on anthropologists' conceptions of the social and the idea of society, I now want to spend this clip really going into the ways in which that influence of Durkheim's work was taken up and amplified in all sorts of ways, actually, in British social anthropology, in its what some people would feel was its golden age, roughly from the kind of 1920s through to the 1950s, 1960s. That period of classical social anthropology owes so much to Durkheim's conception of society. And that's really what we're going to be looking at in this clip. So one of the key ways, in fact, the key concept to come out of Durkheim that was picked up by the Brits, if you like, in their readings of his work, was the idea that social institutions have a function. You'll remember from the previous clip this organic analogy that is so powerful in Durkheim's work, and the idea that different social institutions hang together by the degree, a bit like the organs of a body might hang together in the sense that they all contribute to the living of to the reproduction through time of the organism. The same goes for social institutions, says Durkheim. They all have a function and they contribute to the well-functioning, ordered society. So the Brits take this idea and make a great deal of it, as we'll see. But before going to that, I wanted to just give you a little bit of the context in which this rise of British social anthropology happens. And this is, of course, the context of colonialism, of empire. So anthropologists working in Britain are deeply imbricated with the political project of the British Empire at the time, which involves, of course, ruling over a vast amount of territory in parts of Asia, in parts of Africa, in parts of Oceania, which the British conquered in different ways and became rulers of. And a key concept through which this, as it was called at the time, Pax Britannica, I don't know how peaceful it was, Pax is Latin for peace, it wasn't peaceful at all, but the idea that somehow the British Empire was maintaining the peace in all of these territories that it had rule over was perpetuated through the idea of indirect rule. So the idea was that these different territories would have their own local authorities, local people would be running local affairs, as long as these local authorities paid tribute to the colonial administrators and allowed the colonial administrators ultimately to retain control of resources, of external affairs, and so on. So this idea of indirect rule implied that the British colonial administrators needed to have quite a good understanding of how local affairs were run and how local authority was constituted. And that is a space in which anthropologists crowded in many ways, right? So anthropological studies at the time were useful to this colonial project in as much as they gave an insight to the political rulers of the kind of traditional, as they were seen, structures of authority, of dispute resolution, of the distribution of resources and so on, that the colonial authorities needed to know about in order to be able to manage and rule the colonial territories effectively, right? So I put up here the maps of Papua New Guinea and its environs and of Africa to give you a flavor of the kinds of territories that the British were controlling at the time. And it's quite interesting to see and quite problematic for, viewed from today's viewpoint, to see that the classic studies of British social anthropology that we so often refer to are studies of course, areas that the British Empire was controlling. So I talked about the ways in which Durkheim's idea of function were picked up. Let's drill into that a little bit further by looking at what's come to be referred to as the British Functionalist school. And this involves two key figures, Bronislaw Malinowski, who was actually Polish emigre who was presiding over the LSE Department of Anthropology for many, many years. He ended his career in America, but his most productive period was spent in London at the LSE. And Radcliffe Brown, who over a similar period of time was absolutely dominant in anthropology at Oxford. Now, both of these figures cast their work in reaction to the kind of anthropology that I talked about in the first week when I was referring to the tussle between between evolutionism and diffusionism in 19th century anthropology, with evolutionism being the dominant paradigm, this idea that cultural differences can be ordered in an evolutionary sequence of development, right? So a kind of hierarchy of cultures and societies from the most primitive and simple to the most civilized and complex, to put it very, very crudely, which is how the terminology that was used at the time. Now, both Radcliffe Brown and Malinowski react against this, right? And say that the way to understand the peculiarities, the differences, the specificities of each social group that an anthropologist might study is not with reference to some grand evolutionary scheme, but rather with reference to the way in which different institutions in that society perform a function in the present. What do different institutions in that society, different practices, different ideas contribute to the overall functioning of the society and the people whose lives unfold within it, right? So the emphasis here is a turn away from diachronic models, like the evolutionary sequence from one stage of development to another, to synchronic studies, right? Local customs and beliefs, those are the kinds of words that anthropologists would use at the time, serve necessary purposes in the present, and it's the job of anthropologists to work out what these might be. Even practices that appear very irrational, right? Beliefs in supernatural spirits and animism, or practices that seem unusual in relation to kinship, things that were alien to the Victorian and post-Victorian sensibilities of these anthropologists. All of these things could be understood scientifically if the anthropologist could explain why these even irrational practices and beliefs serve a purpose for the people who engage in them. That's the central idea of functionalism. Now, actually, the way in which Malinowski on the one hand and Radcliffe Brown take up this idea of function is actually rather different. And to put it very, very simply, Malinowski's tendency is very much individualistic, and in that sense is not at all really Durkheimian. He takes the idea of function from Durkheim, but turns it into this kind of very pragmatic idea about how social institutions have functions in as much as they help individual people, the people who live in any given society, to get on with their lives better, to address their concerns and their needs. So social practices, ideas, meanings, beliefs, and so on have a function in as much as they help individuals for Malinowski. And really his key instinct in that famous book that we still all read because it's such a kind of iconic origin point for British social anthropology, the Argonauts of the Western Pacific, which looks at this Kula ring, the famous Kula ring. So these are the Trobriand Islands off the coast of Papua New Guinea, in which people navigate with their canoes from one island to another and engage in this very complex tapestry of ceremonial gift exchange, exchanging ceremonial bracelets and necklaces, right? Now, this is a social institution, which is described in great detail by Malinowski in this book, The Argonauts. Note the kind of reference to classical Greece here, right? And the fundamental instinct that guides that book is really to try and convey to his readers that all of these practices that may seem so primitive from the point of view of these Victorian, post-Victorian readers of the book It's rather post-Victorian, I should say. It's 1922 the book came out, so it's not actually the right word to use in this context. But it's in the aftermath of that kind of spirit of 19th century development of anthropology that the book was written. All of these practices that may seem so exotic and unusual and alien to the readers, actually, if you look close enough, make the people who engage in them feel like people who are very much like us. They have the same kind of concerns that we readers of this book in Britain at the time, that's the we here, might feel are absolutely normal and understandable if you look at them closely enough, right? So to cut a very long story short, for Malinowski, the whole argument is that this complex sequence of ceremonial exchanges that the Kula exchange involves, that the Kula ring, as it was called, involves, if you look beyond this exotic facade of it, is just a collection of very reasonable individuals doing very reasonable things, which is attempting to enhance their own prestige. There's a masculine prestige involved in these ceremonial exchanges. These people are competing against each other. And the Kula ring is really just the field in which this competition for prestige is taking place. If Malinowski himself was, if you like, competing with Radcliffe Brown and others through writing books and running seminars and teaching PhD students and so on, the Trobriands were competing each other through exchanging necklaces and bracelets and engaging in this seafaring that they were doing. So the quote-unquote savage, and this is a word that Malinowski himself uses in order to undo, in a sense, by showing how what may seem like, uncivilized behavior to the sensibilities of European middle-class and upper-class people at the time was actually quite rational if you looked at it closely enough. That was the idea. The key idea here is just that function is individual, right? So the Kula ring functions and can be explained in terms of its function in promoting the interests and concerns of the individuals involved in it, their concern for prestige. Now, Radcliffe Brown's functionalism is actually very, very different and much more Durkheimian than Malinowski's, because his conception is really that social institutions can be explained in terms of their function, not on individuals' lives, but in contributing to the ordered functioning of the whole society to which they belong. So very much this organic analogy that we saw in relation to Durkheim is at the forefront of Radcliffe Brown's thinking here, right? Now, just to give you a little bit of background, Radcliffe Brown did very classic kind of Victorian style anthropology. The old way of doing anthropology was to go out in big groups and do these expeditions, a very colonial thing to do in these far-flung places. And that's the kind of engagement and research that Radcliffe Brown was involved in 1906 to 1908. He went to the Indian Ocean, to the Andaman Islands, and wrote this monograph that's called The Andaman Islanders, based very much in this kind of classic way of doing fieldwork that they did in the 19th century. But when he comes back to Britain, he has this revelation when he reads Durkheim's, and he gets effectively converted into the Durkheimian approach of studying society in this scientific, social fact-based way that we saw in the previous clip. So he shows no interest in individuals and how their lives unfold, but really seeks to establish a comparative science of societies as systemic orders that reproduce themselves over time. So social anthropology for Radcliffe Brown is the comparative study of systems, of social systems, of structures, and how they reproduce themselves organically over time. And I have a quote here that illustrates Radcliffe Brown's emphasis on social structure, very much in opposition to Malinowski, who in a way is more interested in the Tom, Dick and Harry kind of level of analysis that Radcliffe Brown is disparaging in this quote. So for Radcliffe Brown, we have the comparative study of organic wholes. And this word holism, and I put a little asterisk on the slide to indicate the Greek origins of the word from the word holon, which means whole in ancient Greek, and that's why you spell holism without a W, because it comes from the Greek, which has no W. Just a note there for your spelling in your essays. So this word holism is really important for Radcliffe Brown. It's this organic analogy again. You're looking at societies as wholes rather than picking out little bits of them and looking at them in an isolated way, right? So the study of society should be understood as a rigorous scientific enterprise for him, right? So rather than vague notions of individual self-interest, what we look at is unambiguously at the structure of the social system as anthropologists, right? And we do that comparatively. We can see how different systems in different parts of the world, or neighboring systems that might be influencing each other, operate, and understand that scientifically by showing how each institution within those systems contributes and supports the overall functioning of the system. So a nice quote here from Radcliffe Brown is to say, every custom and belief of a primitive society, note the language, plays some determinate part in the social life of the community, just as every organ of a living body plays some part in the general life of the organism. So this is the kind of Durkheimian organic analogy really kind of put out there by Radcliffe Brown in the text, right? So what Radcliffe Brown is interested in is a kind of synchronic comparative project. He's not interested in historical development. He wants to develop almost like a typology of essential types of societies, looking at the building blocks that make them up and looking at the possible ways in which societies can be built out of institutions supporting each other in particular ways, right? So he's kind of trying to decipher the structural possibilities for social functioning, if you like, right? And for him, this is a scientific endeavor in as much as it can be done systematically by looking at many, many different social possibilities. So anthropology was really important in going to all these different parts of the world, collecting data so that the structural functionalist approach could put them all next to each other and start comparing them and trying to draw conclusions about the underlying possibilities of structural formations that might operate in different social contexts. Now, just to give you a flavor of Radcliffe Brown kind of analysis, let me just very, very quickly run through his famous argument about the significance of the mother's brother. Now, this is a classic observation that anthropologists at the time were debating. Many anthropologists noticed that in systems of kinship, and notice this focus on kinship is very typical for British structural functionalism at the time, because it's all about social structure, right? Who gets to marry with whom? The system of kinship is the building block, the algebra, if you like, through which society is built up as a social fabric that has a structure to it for anthropologists working at the time. So in patrilineal societies, it was noticed by anthropologists in different parts of the world, but not least in parts of Africa, there is this tendency for the relationship between a man and his mother's brother, so his maternal uncle, to have a very light-hearted, joking character. So while your relationship with your father and your father's brother is very stern and serious and marked by all sorts of social practices of respect, your relationship with your mother's your mother's brother, if you're a man, is a joking relationship. It's a light-hearted relationship. It's an irreverent relationship, right? Now, evolutionist anthropologists had made the argument that this might indicate that actually this is a kind of evolutionary hangover from an earlier stage of development in which societies were matrilineal. So people looked at their mother's side more than at their father's side, and, for example, inherited property from their mother's side more than their father's side. That's a matrilineal society. But then in these patrilineal societies, you have this soft, jocular relationship with your mother's side, and the question is, why is that? And the evolutionist anthropologists were saying, that might indicate that at a previous stage of development, you had a matrilineal society rather than a patrilineal society. However, Radcliffe Brown, as part of his critique of these evolutionary models, will have none of that. His argument about the mother's-brother joking relationship is that this can be understood synchronically with reference to the structured way in which patrilineal relationships work. And he says that effectively what we have in a patrilineal society is a situation in which men are in a harsh relationship with the men, their fathers and their fathers' brothers, the men on their father's side, because they're competing with them, because what's at stake in those relationships is ownership of goods, right? So basically, there's a kind of competition for resources, for inheritance, for prestige, for power, with the men in your father's side of your family. On the other hand, with your mother's side, you have this soft relationship with the men in that side, with your maternal uncle, to counterbalance the harshness of the relationships that you have on the paternal side, right? So you can think of your maternal uncles, says Radcliffe Brown, as in a sense extensions of your own mother. You have a nurturing, caring relationship on that side of your family. And in some sense, your maternal uncles are male mothers of yours. So the point here is that he's explaining a particular social practice, these joking relationships, with reference to the structural relationships between two sides of your family tree, if you like, as these operate in a patrilineal context, which is the way that those societies where these jocular relationships occur were organized. So it's with reference to this social organization that this social practice is being explained. Now, I've gone into the trouble on this slide to draw out the kinship diagram that explains this. And I did this more than anything in order to acquaint you with how kinship diagrams work. I've got all those symbols, the triangles, the circles, the lines above and the lines below. And I've explained all of them with a little legend. So I hope that you can use these slides to just be aware of how kinship diagrams work, because this is part of how anthropologists have been operating since the time of structural functionalism. And still today, you will encounter anthropologists trying to make arguments with reference to the structure of kinship relationship and using these diagrammatic forms. Some people have said that kinship is the algebra of anthropology. Well, this is the symbolism, if you like, the language of this algebra. So finally, here's some pictures of some very famous people that Radcliffe Brown and Malinowski together influenced and who were the kind of examples of the golden age, as it's seen of kind of colonial, late colonial British social anthropology and structural functionalism. You've got Evans Pritchard, Maya Fortes, Audrey Richard, Godfrey Lienhardt, Mary Douglas, famous for her to us because she was, of course, working at UCL. She's the kind of UCL flagship anthropologist. Particularly in her early part of her career, she was very much a structural functionalist, trained by Evans Pritchard, the guy in the very left of the slide. So that's a picture of the kinds of ancestors that still influence the way that we think in social anthropology today, although subject to a lot of critique, as we'll find out in subsequent lectures.